The sound that woke Samuel Carter at 3:17 a.m. wasn't the usual creak of old barnwood settling or the restless shuffling of his horses. It was something else entirely, a soft whimpering that seemed to float on the November wind like a ghost seeking shelter. Samuel had lived alone on his ranch in Cedar Valley, Wyoming for 8 years, ever since his wife Emma died in childbirth along with their son. And he had grown accustomed to the profound silence that surrounded his property like a protective blanket. But this sound was different, human, desperate. Samuel pulled on his boots and grabbed the lantern from beside his bed, his weathered hands steady despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. At 42, he had the lean, strong build of a man who had spent his life working the land, his dark hair now streaked with silver at the temples, and his blue eyes holding the kind of depth that comes from experiencing both profound loss and hard-won wisdom. The Wyoming wind cut through his shirt as he stepped outside, carrying with it the promise of an early winter and something else, the unmistakable scent of fear and desperation that seemed to cling to the air like smoke from a dying fire. What he found in his stable would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's lantern cast dancing shadows across the barn walls as he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar scent of hay and horses filling his nostrils. But underneath those comforting smells was something that made his stomach clench, the metallic tang of blood and the sour odor of unwashed bodies and genuine terror. The whimpering grew louder as he stepped deeper into the barn, and then his lantern light fell upon a sight that would be burned into his memory forever. Huddled in the far corner of an empty stall, pressed against the wooden walls as if trying to disappear into them, was a woman and 6 children. The woman couldn't have been more than 28, with auburn hair that had been beautiful once, but now hung in matted tangles around a face that told a story of recent violence. Her left eye was swollen shut, purple and angry, and her split lip had crusted over with dried blood. Her clothes, once a simple blue dress, were torn and stained, hanging on her thin frame like rags on a scarecrow. But it was the children that made Samuel's heart constrict with a pain he hadn't felt since Emma's death. 6 pairs of eyes stared back at him in the lamplight, ranging in age from what appeared to be about 12 down to perhaps 3 years old. They were pressed against the woman like baby birds seeking warmth, their faces gaunt with hunger, and their clothes little more than threadbare scraps that provided no protection against the Wyoming cold. The oldest, a boy with sandy brown hair and eyes that held far too much responsibility for his young age, had positioned himself protectively in front of the others. His thin arms were spread wide as if he could shield his family from whatever new danger Samuel might represent. The other children, 4 girls and another boy, clung to each other with the desperate intensity of those who had learned that the world was not a safe place. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible and rough with exhaustion. "Please don't turn us away. We'll leave at first light, I promise. We just needed somewhere warm for the night." Samuel set the lantern down carefully, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to frighten them further. He could see the way they all tensed when he moved, ready to bolt despite their obvious exhaustion. These were people who had learned to fear strangers, to expect cruelty rather than kindness. "Ma'am," Samuel said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he had once used with spooked horses, "you're hurt. These children are freezing. Nobody's going anywhere tonight." The woman's good eye filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink away. "We don't want any trouble, mister. We can pay you." Her hand fumbled in the pocket of her torn dress and produced a few crumpled bills and some coins. "This is all we have, but you can have it if you just let us stay until morning." Samuel's heart broke a little more as he looked at the pitiful amount of money, maybe $3 in total, that represented everything these people had in the world. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Keep your money," he said firmly. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, clearly torn between the need for help and the instinct to protect whatever secrets she was carrying. Finally she whispered, "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Morrison. These are my children." Samuel nodded, though. Something in her eyes suggested there was more to that story than she was willing to share just yet. "I'm Samuel Carter, and this is my ranch. You're safe here, Elizabeth. All of you." The oldest boy spoke for the first time, his voice cracking with the change that comes at his age, but still holding a fierce protectiveness. "How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know you won't hurt Ma like he did?" Samuel knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "What's your name, son?" "Michael," the boy replied, his chin jutting out with defiance despite the fear in his eyes. "Michael, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I lost my own wife and child 8 years ago, and since then, this ranch has been the loneliest place on earth. I would never hurt a woman or a child, because I know what it feels like to lose everything you love." Something in Samuel's voice, the raw honesty of shared pain, seemed to reach the boy. Michael's defensive posture relaxed slightly, though. He remained alert and ready to protect his family. "Now," Samuel continued, "I'm going to go back to the house and prepare some food and warm water for washing. This barn is no place for people, especially not in this weather. There's a spare room in my house where you can all stay warm and safe." Elizabeth tried to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement clearly caused her pain. "We can't impose like that, Mr. Carter. We're strangers. You don't owe us anything." "Maybe not," Samuel agreed, "but you're human beings in need, and I've got a warm house and plenty of food. Seems to me that's all the reason I need." He looked at the children more closely in the lamplight, taking inventory of their condition. With the practiced eye of someone who had raised livestock and knew the signs of neglect and suffering. The youngest, a little girl with dark curls who couldn't have been more than 3, was clearly running a fever, her cheeks flushed and her breathing shallow. The second youngest, a boy of perhaps 5, had a persistent cough that spoke of chest congestion that could turn dangerous without proper care. 2 of the middle children, girls who looked to be twins of about 7, were so thin that their bones showed clearly through their skin, and their eyes had the hollow look of children who had been hungry for far too long. The third girl, maybe 9 years old, had a bandage wrapped around her left hand that was stained with old blood, and she held the injured appendage protectively against her chest. These children weren't just hungry and cold, they were sick, injured, and traumatized. They needed medical attention, proper nutrition, and most importantly, they needed to feel safe again. Samuel stood slowly, his mind already working through what needed to be done first. "I'm going to carry the little ones to the house first, then come back for the rest of you. It's warmer there, and I can get some food into you." "I can walk," Michael said quickly, his pride evident even in his weakened state. "I'm sure you can," Samuel replied with respect. "But your mother is hurt, and she might need help. Could you stay with her and help her to the house while I carry the youngest ones?" It was a diplomatic way of giving the boy something important to do while acknowledging his role as protector of the family. Michael nodded seriously, understanding the responsibility being entrusted to him. Samuel approached the youngest girl carefully, speaking in soft, reassuring tones. "Hey there, sweetheart, what's your name?" The little girl looked up at him with fever-bright eyes. "Lucy," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name," Samuel said gently. "Lucy, I'm going to carry you to my house where it's warm, okay? Your mama and Michael are going to come right behind us." Lucy looked to Elizabeth for permission, and when her mother nodded weakly, she allowed Samuel to lift her into his arms. She weighed so little that Samuel felt a surge of anger at whoever had allowed these children to reach such a state of neglect. Her small body was burning with fever, and she shivered despite the heat radiating from her skin. As Samuel carried Lucy toward the house, followed by Elizabeth leaning heavily on Michael's thin shoulder, and the other children trailing behind. Like a small parade of walking wounded, he found his mind racing with questions and concerns. Who had hurt Elizabeth so badly? Where had they come from, and what were they running from? How long had these children been without proper food and shelter? But more immediately pressing were the practical concerns. He needed to get them all warm and fed, assess their injuries and illnesses, and figure out how to provide appropriate sleeping arrangements for 7 unexpected guests. His house, built for a family that had never materialized, suddenly seemed both too large and too small for the task ahead. The ranch house Samuel had built with his own hands 8 years earlier was solid and well constructed, with thick walls that kept out the Wyoming wind and a large stone fireplace that could heat the main living areas effectively. He had designed it with the hope that he and Emma would fill it with children, adding rooms as their family grew. Instead, it had become a monument to lost dreams, its empty bedrooms serving as painful reminders of what might have been. Now, as he carried a feverish little girl through his front door, followed by a parade of desperate souls seeking shelter, Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. The house that had echoed with loneliness for 8 years suddenly felt alive again, filled with the sounds of human need and the possibility of purpose. He settled Lucy on the couch near the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until it roared with warmth. Elizabeth sank into a chair nearby, her face pale with exhaustion and pain, while the other children gathered close to the fire like flowers turning toward the sun. "First things first," Samuel said, rolling up his sleeves with the efficiency of a man accustomed to handling crises. "We need to get some warm food into all of you, and then we'll see about getting those injuries looked at." As he bustled around his kitchen, preparing a simple but nourishing meal of soup and bread, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. Despite their obvious suffering, there was something in the way they cared for each other, the way Michael automatically helped the younger ones, the way Elizabeth tried to smooth the twins' hair despite her own pain, the way they all instinctively moved to protect and comfort one another. That spoke of a family bond that had been forged and strengthened by shared hardship. These weren't just random strangers who had stumbled into his barn. They were a family, and families like this one, bound together by love and determination rather than just blood, were rare and precious things. Samuel had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself, to have people who depended on him and needed his care. As the soup heated and the bread warmed, filling his kitchen with aromas that spoke of home and comfort, Samuel made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. Whatever had brought Elizabeth Morrison and her 6 children to his stable in the middle of a November night, whatever they were running from or toward, they were safe now. He would make sure of that. And perhaps, in saving them, he might find a way to save himself from the lonely existence that had become his life since Emma's death. Perhaps God had brought them together for reasons that none of them yet understood, but that would become clear in the days and weeks ahead. The wind howled outside his warm house, but inside, 7 souls who had been lost were beginning to find their way home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Cedar Valley, painting the ranch in muted shades of silver and brown that matched the somber mood inside Samuel's house. He had spent the night in his kitchen chair, dozing fitfully while keeping watch over his unexpected guests. Every few hours he had checked on little Lucy, whose fever had spiked dangerously during the night, and tended to the fire that kept the house warm against the November chill. Elizabeth had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep on the couch, her battered face peaceful for the first time since Samuel had found them. The children were scattered around the living room on makeshift beds of blankets and pillows, Their small bodies finally relaxed after what must have been weeks of constant tension and fear. Samuel studied them in the early morning light, taking mental inventory of their conditions now that he could see them clearly. Michael, the 12-year-old protector, had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights watching over his family. Even in sleep, his hand rested protectively on the shoulder of Thomas, the 5-year-old whose persistent cough had kept Samuel worried throughout the night. The twins, Sarah and Sophie, lay curled together like sleeping kittens, their identical faces gaunt but serene. At 7 years old, they should have been plump with baby fat and rosy with health. Instead, they looked like fragile birds, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks that told the story of prolonged hunger. 9-year-old Anna slept with her injured hand cradled against her chest, the blood-stained bandage a stark reminder that their recent troubles had involved more than just lack of food and shelter. Samuel made a mental note to examine that wound once she woke up. Infection was a serious threat, especially in someone already weakened by malnutrition. And little Lucy, barely 3 years old, lay burning with fever despite the cool cloths Samuel had been applying to her forehead throughout the night. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and occasional whimpers escaped her lips even in sleep. Samuel had seen enough sick animals to recognize the signs of serious illness, and this child needed medical attention soon. The sound of movement from the couch drew his attention back to Elizabeth. She was trying to sit up, moving carefully to avoid aggravating what were clearly painful injuries. In the morning light, the full extent of her beating was even more apparent. Bruises covered her arms in the distinctive pattern of finger marks, and the way she held her left side suggested possible broken ribs. "How long have I been asleep?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "About 4 hours," Samuel replied softly, not wanting to wake the children. "How are you feeling?" Elizabeth's good eye swept over her children, automatically checking to ensure they were all safe and accounted for before answering. "I've been better," she admitted with a weak attempt at humor. "But the children ... are they okay?" "Lucy felt so hot last night." "She's got a high fever," Samuel said honestly. "And that cough the little boy has concerns me. I think we need to get Dr. Harrison out here to take a look at them." Fear flashed across Elizabeth's face. A doctor means questions, records, people. "Knowing we're here." Samuel moved closer, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Elizabeth, these children are sick. Whatever you're running from, it can't be worth risking their lives." Tears began to flow down Elizabeth's cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. "You don't understand. If he finds us ... if Marcus finds us, he'll kill me. And then what happens to the children?" The name Marcus hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Samuel felt his jaw tighten with anger at whoever had put such terror into this woman's eyes. "Who is Marcus?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My husband, their stepfather. Though he's not. He never legally adopted them." The story that emerged over the next hour, told in whispered fragments between checking on the children, painted a picture of systematic abuse and escalating violence that made Samuel's hands clench into fists. Elizabeth Morrison had been widowed at 24 when her first husband died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with 6 young children and no means of support. Marcus Blackwood had seemed like salvation when he offered to marry her and provide for the family. He owned a successful freight business in Cheyenne and presented himself as a respectable businessman who wanted a ready-made family. Elizabeth, desperate and with few options, had agreed to the marriage despite her children's instinctive dislike of the man. "At first he was charming," Elizabeth continued, unconsciously touching her swollen eye. "He bought the children clothes and toys, promised me we'd never want for anything. But after the wedding, everything changed." Marcus, it turned out, had married Elizabeth not out of love, but out of a desire for control and possession. He viewed her children as inconveniences to be tolerated at best, and at worst, as targets for his growing rage and violence. He forbade Elizabeth from leaving the house without permission, controlled every penny of household money, and gradually isolated her from any friends or family who might offer support. "The first time he hit Michael was 6 months after we married," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with remembered horror. "Michael had accidentally broken a lamp while playing, and Marcus ... He just exploded. He beat that poor boy so badly, he couldn't sit down for a week." The pattern escalated over the 2 years that followed. Marcus's business gave him excuses to travel frequently, and during his absences, Elizabeth would discover the extent of his cruelty toward the children. He withheld food as punishment, locked them in closets for hours, and used his belt liberally for the smallest infractions. 3 weeks ago, he came home drunk and angry about some business deal that had gone wrong. Elizabeth continued, unconsciously pulling her torn dress closer around her body. Anna had left her school books on the kitchen table, and he grabbed her hand and slammed it in the door. I heard the bones break. Samuel's knuckles went white as he gripped his coffee cup. "That's when you decided to leave?" "I should have left sooner," Elizabeth said, guilt and self-recrimination heavy in her voice. "I kept thinking he would change, that if I could just be a better wife, if the children could just be more careful. But when I saw Anna's hand, when I heard her screaming, I knew he was going to kill one of them eventually, maybe all of them." The escape had been planned in desperation rather than carefully thought out. Elizabeth had hidden small amounts of money over several months, gathering supplies and waiting for Marcus to leave on one of his longer business trips. When he departed for what was supposed to be a week-long journey to Denver, she had gathered the children and what belongings they could carry and fled in the middle of the night. "We've been walking for 2 weeks," Elizabeth said. "Sleeping in abandoned buildings, begging for food when we could, stealing when we had to. I hoped if we could get far enough away, find some town where he wouldn't think to look for us. How did you end up in my barn?" "The children were so tired, and Lucy's fever started yesterday. We saw your ranch from the road and thought maybe we could rest in the barn for just one night. I never meant for you to find us." Samuel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of his ranch while processing everything Elizabeth had told him. 2 weeks of running with 6 children, sleeping rough, scrounging for food. It was a miracle they had survived at all, but now they were here, and he had a choice to make. Behind him, he heard Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath. "Oh no, Lucy's burning up." Samuel turned to see the little girl thrashing restlessly on her makeshift bed, her cheeks flushed, bright red with fever. Elizabeth was already on her feet, despite her injuries, maternal instinct overriding her own pain. "We need to cool her down," Samuel said, moving quickly to help. Together, they carried Lucy to the kitchen and began applying cool, damp cloths to her forehead and arms. The child's skin was so hot it seemed to radiate heat, and her breathing had become even more labored. "Please," Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't let her die. I can't lose her too." "She's not going to die," Samuel said firmly, though privately he was deeply concerned. "But Elizabeth, we need that doctor now." The internal struggle was visible on Elizabeth's face, the terror of being discovered warring with her love for her children. Finally, maternal instinct won. If you're sure he can be trusted ... Dr. Harrison delivered half the babies in this county, Samuel assured her. "He's a good man, and he knows how to keep his mouth shut when necessary." While Samuel rode to fetch the doctor, Elizabeth found herself alone with her children for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The house felt warm and safe in a way that seemed almost foreign after so many months of fear and uncertainty. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't listening for the sound of Marcus's footsteps, wasn't calculating escape routes or planning how to position herself between him and the children. Michael woke first, his protective instincts immediately alert as he assessed their surroundings. "Ma, where's Mr. Carter?" "He went to fetch a doctor for Lucy," Elizabeth explained, smoothing her son's sandy hair. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better," Michael admitted. "It's warm here." "And Mr. Carter. He seems different from Marcus." Different. Such a simple word to encompass the vast gulf between Marcus Blackwood's cruelty and Samuel Carter's quiet kindness. Elizabeth had spent so long living in fear that she had almost forgotten there were men in the world who didn't use their strength to hurt others. One by one, the other children woke, and for the first time in weeks, Elizabeth saw something she had thought lost forever: hope in their eyes. They were still weak, still scared, still bearing the physical and emotional scars of their ordeal. But they were warm and safe, and for children who had learned to live moment by moment, that was enough. Anna was the last to wake, and when she did, it was with a cry of pain from her injured hand. Elizabeth carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage to find the wound red and swollen with infection. 2 of the fingers were clearly broken, bent at unnatural angles, and the whole hand was hot to the touch. "I know it hurts, baby," Elizabeth whispered, fighting back tears of rage at the man who had done this to her innocent child. "The doctor is coming, and he'll fix it." When Samuel returned with Dr. Harrison an hour later, he found the family gathered around the kitchen table, sharing a simple breakfast of eggs and toast that Elizabeth had prepared from his well-stocked pantry. It was a scene of domestic normalcy that belied the trauma they had all endured, and Samuel felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sight. Dr. Harrison was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had been practicing medicine on the frontier for over 30 years and had seen every kind of injury and illness imaginable. But even his experienced gaze hardened when he saw the condition of Elizabeth and the children. "Good Lord," he muttered under his breath, then louder, "let's get these young ones looked at properly." What followed was a thorough examination that confirmed Samuel's worst fears. Lucy had pneumonia and would need careful nursing to survive. Thomas's cough was the early stages of the same illness. Anna's hand showed signs of serious infection that could lead to blood poisoning if not treated immediately. All the children showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, and Elizabeth had 3 cracked ribs along with her other injuries. These children need weeks of proper care and nutrition to fully recover, Dr. Harrison told Samuel privately while Elizabeth was helping. "The twins get dressed after their examination, and that woman has been beaten badly enough that she could have internal injuries I can't detect without proper hospital facilities. Will they be all right?" Samuel asked. "With proper care, yes. But Samuel, I have to ask, what's the situation here? These injuries, they're not accidental." Samuel had known this question would come, and he had spent the ride to town deciding how to handle it. Dr. Harrison was a good man, but he was also bound by certain professional and legal obligations. "They're running from someone dangerous," Samuel said simply. "Someone who hurt them badly and would hurt them worse if he found them." Dr. Harrison studied Samuel's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I see. And you're planning to help them?" "Yes, good," the doctor said firmly. "Because those children deserve better than what they've been getting. And that woman has shown remarkable courage in getting them this far." As Dr. Harrison prepared to leave, having done what he could with the supplies available, he pulled Samuel aside once more. "I'll need to come back in a few days to check on Lucy and change Anna's bandages," he said. "And Samuel, if anyone comes asking about a woman and 6 children, I never saw them." After the doctor left, Samuel found himself standing in his suddenly full house, watching Elizabeth help her children settle in for rest as their medications began to take effect. The transformation from desperate refugees to a family beginning to heal was already visible. And Samuel realized that something fundamental had shifted in his own life as well. For 8 years, he had been merely existing, going through the motions of life without real purpose or joy. Now watching Michael carefully help his younger siblings, seeing Elizabeth's gentle patience despite her own pain, observing the way the children looked out for each other with the fierce love that comes from shared hardship, Samuel felt truly alive for the first time since Emma's death. These people needed him, and perhaps just as importantly, he needed them. The question was, how long could they stay hidden before Marcus Blackwood tracked them down? And what would Samuel do when that day came? Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising another harsh Wyoming winter. But inside his house, Samuel Carter had found something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. And he intended to do exactly that, no matter what it cost him. 3 days had passed since Dr. Harrison's visit, and the ranch house had begun to take on the rhythm of a functioning household. Samuel found himself marveling at how quickly the space had transformed from the echoing monument to loneliness it had been into something that actually felt like a home. The sounds of children's voices, the rustle of Elizabeth moving quietly through the kitchen, even the occasional argument between the twins over whose turn it was to help with chores, all of it brought a warmth to the house that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Lucy's fever had finally broken on the second day, leaving her weak but alert, her big brown eyes following Samuel's movements around the room with curious interest rather than the fear that had marked her first days at the ranch. Thomas's cough was improving under the careful administration of the medicines Dr. Harrison had left. Though he still tired easily and needed frequent rest, Anna's hand was healing slowly but steadily. The infection had responded well to the doctor's treatment, and while she would always carry scars from the deliberately broken bones, Dr. Harrison was confident she would regain full use of her fingers with time and careful therapy. Samuel had fashioned a special splint from wood and leather that allowed her to move the uninjured fingers while protecting the healing bones. But it was the changes in the family's dynamics that struck Samuel most profoundly. Away from the constant threat of violence, the children were beginning to reveal their true personalities. Michael, relieved of the crushing responsibility of being the sole protector of his siblings, had started to act more like the 12-year-old boy he actually was. Samuel had caught him yesterday, building an elaborate fort out of hay bales in the barn. His face lit up with the kind of joy that Samuel suspected had been absent from his life for far too long. The twins, Sarah and Sophie, had surprised everyone by revealing distinctly different personalities once they felt safe enough to express themselves. Sarah was the practical one, always looking for ways to help with household tasks and showing a remarkable aptitude for cooking despite her young age. Sophie was the dreamer, spending hours drawing pictures with pencils Samuel had found in his desk, creating elaborate stories about the horses and cattle she observed through the windows. Even Elizabeth was changing. The constant tension that had kept her shoulders rigid and her eyes constantly scanning for danger was slowly easing. Samuel would catch glimpses of the woman she must have been before Marcus Blackwood entered her life, quick-witted, gentle with her children but firm when needed, possessed of a quiet strength that had kept her family together through their darkest hours. It was on the 4th morning that their fragile peace was threatened. Samuel was in the barn, teaching Michael how to properly care for the horses when he heard the sound of approaching riders. The boy's face went white at the sound, and Samuel felt his own stomach clench with sudden fear. Through the barn window, he could see 2 men on horseback approaching the house at a steady pace. They weren't riding like men in a hurry, but there was something purposeful about their movement that set off alarm bells in Samuel's mind. "Michael, go to the house quickly," Samuel instructed, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "Tell your mother to gather the children in the back bedroom and stay quiet. Don't let anyone see you." The boy nodded and slipped out the back of the barn, running low across the yard to the house. Samuel watched him disappear through the kitchen door, then turned his attention back to the approaching riders. They were strangers to him, but their type was familiar enough on the frontier, hard men with the look of those who made their living through violence or the threat of it. Both were well armed, with the confident bearing of men accustomed to intimidating others. The leader was a tall, lean man with a carefully groomed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and position. His companion was younger and broader, with the scarred hands and broken nose of a man who had spent considerable time in physical altercations. Samuel stepped out of the barn and walked toward his house, positioning himself to intercept the riders before they could reach the front door. His own rifle was inside the house, but he wore his sidearm as he always did when working around the ranch. He hoped he wouldn't need it. "Good morning, gentlemen," Samuel called out as they approached, projecting the casual friendliness of a rancher greeting unexpected but welcome visitors. "What brings you out to Cedar Valley?" The well-dressed man reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat in polite acknowledgement, but his eyes were cold and calculating as they surveyed Samuel and the ranch buildings. "Name's Marcus Blackwood," he said, and Samuel felt ice form in his veins despite his careful control of his expression. "This is my associate, Jake Morrison. We're looking for my wife and her children. They've been missing for several weeks now, and I'm worried sick about them." Samuel's mind raced even as he maintained his neutral expression. This was the man Elizabeth had described, the monster who had systematically terrorized her family for 2 years. In person, he was exactly what Samuel had expected, charming on the surface, but with an undercurrent of controlled violence that was visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles," Samuel replied, injecting just the right note of concern into his voice. "Missing family is every man's worst nightmare. I'm Samuel Carter, and this is my ranch. I haven't seen any woman and children in these parts, but you're welcome to water your horses and rest a bit." Marcus's eyes sharpened slightly, studying Samuel's face for any sign of deception. "That's kind of you, Mr. Carter. My wife, she's not been well lately. Confused, you understand. She took the children and left in the middle of the night. I'm afraid she might not be thinking clearly." It was smoothly done, Samuel had to admit. Anyone who didn't know the truth would hear a concerned husband worried about his mentally unstable wife. But Samuel had seen Elizabeth's injuries, had heard the terror in her voice when she spoke Marcus's name, and he knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. "That's terrible," Samuel said, shaking his head in apparent sympathy. "How long have they been missing?" 3 weeks now, Marcus replied. "They were seen heading west out of Cheyenne, and we've been following their trail as best we can." "You haven't seen any signs of travelers through here recently?" Samuel pretended to think carefully, even as every instinct screamed at him to reach for his gun and end this threat permanently. But he was outnumbered, and more importantly, any violence here could put Elizabeth and the children at risk if Marcus had more men waiting nearby. "Can't say that I have," Samuel said finally. "But then, my ranch is a bit off the main travel routes. Most folks heading west would stick to the more established roads." Jake Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice rough with the accent of someone from the rougher parts of Chicago. "Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes people hole up in barns or outbuildings when they're desperate." The request was polite enough, but there was an underlying threat in Morrison's tone that made it clear refusal wasn't really an option. Samuel nodded slowly, as if considering the reasonableness of the request. "I suppose that would be all right," he said. "Though I should warn you, I've got some valuable breeding horses in the barn, and they don't take kindly to strangers. Best if I go with you to keep them calm." What followed was the longest 30 minutes of Samuel's life. He led the 2 men through his barn, his workshop, and the various outbuildings scattered around the ranch. all while maintaining the casual demeanor of a helpful neighbor. Marcus examined everything with the thorough attention of a man who suspected he was being lied to but couldn't prove it. More than once, Samuel caught him staring at the house with narrowed eyes, clearly wanting to search it as well but unable to justify such an invasion without more evidence. "Your place is pretty isolated out here," Marcus observed as they completed their circuit of the outbuildings. "Don't you get lonely living all by yourself?" "Sometimes," Samuel admitted. "But I like the peace and quiet. Had enough of crowds and noise when I was younger." "No family of your own?" "My wife died some years back," Samuel said, allowing genuine pain to color his voice. "We never had children." It was a calculated revelation, designed to explain his solitary lifestyle while deflecting any suspicion that he might be harboring a woman and 6 children. Marcus nodded sympathetically, but Samuel could see the wheels turning in the man's head, trying to reconcile the story with his suspicions. "Well, we appreciate your time, Mr. Carter," Marcus said finally, remounting his horse. "If you do happen to see anything, a woman with dark hair about this tall, traveling with 6 children, I'd be grateful if you'd send word to the sheriff in Rawlins. There's a reward for information leading to their safe return." "Of course," Samuel agreed. "I hope you find them safe and sound." He watched the 2 men ride away, waiting until they were completely out of sight before allowing himself to breathe normally again. Only then did he hurry back to the house, where he found Elizabeth and the children huddled in the back bedroom, their faces white with terror. "Was it him?" Elizabeth whispered, though the look in her eyes said she already knew the answer. "Yes," Samuel said quietly. "But he's gone now, and he didn't find you." Elizabeth's legs gave out, and she sank onto the bed, her whole body shaking with delayed reaction. "He knows we're in this area. He'll keep looking. He'll check every ranch, every farm, every building until he finds us. Then we need to be smarter than he is," Samuel said firmly. "Michael, help me move some furniture. We're going to make some changes to this house." What followed was an afternoon of frantic but methodical preparation. Samuel had spent enough time on the frontier to know the value of hidden spaces and emergency exits. Working with Michael and the older children, he constructed a concealed room behind the main bedroom, accessible through a panel that looked like part of the wall when closed. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it would hold all 7 of them in an emergency, and it was invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. He also rigged a system of signals, a specific pattern of knocks, a particular way of arranging objects on the porch, subtle signs that would alert Elizabeth and the children to danger while appearing completely innocent to any observer. "If anyone comes asking questions again," Samuel explained as they tested the hiding place, "you all go in there and stay completely silent until I give the all-clear signal. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, you stay hidden." But even as they made these preparations, Samuel knew they were only buying time. Marcus Blackwood was not a man to give up easily, and now that he was in the area, he would continue searching until he found what he was looking for. The question was, how long before he returned, and would Samuel be ready for him when he did? That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table for what had become their nightly ritual, Samuel found himself studying each face in the lamplight. In just a few days, these people had become precious to him in a way he hadn't thought possible. The idea of Marcus Blackwood getting his hands on them again, of subjecting them to more violence and terror, filled Samuel with a cold rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Mr. Carter?" Anna's small voice broke into his dark thoughts. She was holding up a drawing she had made during the afternoon, a picture of all of them standing in front of the ranch house, smiling and holding hands like a real family. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Samuel said, accepting the drawing with gentle hands. "Is this how you see us?" Anna nodded solemnly. "You saved us," she said simply. That makes you family, doesn't it? Samuel felt something break open in his chest at those words. For 8 years, he had believed his chance at family had died with Emma and their unborn son. But here, in the most unlikely circumstances, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I suppose it does." As the children prepared for bed and Elizabeth moved quietly through the house, checking locks and drawing curtains with the automatic caution of someone who had learned to always be watchful, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to wait for Marcus Blackwood to make the next move. He wasn't going to spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering when the monster would return. These people were under his protection now, and he intended to make sure they never had to fear again. Tomorrow he would begin making plans. Real plans, not just defensive measures. Because sometimes, the only way to stop a predator was to become a more dangerous predator yourself. And Samuel Carter, quiet rancher and widower, was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to protect the family he had found in his stable on that cold November night. Samuel rode into Rawlins before dawn, his breath visible in the frigid morning air, as his horse's hooves struck the frozen ground in a steady rhythm. The town was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys and the faint glow of lanterns visible through windows as early risers prepared for another day. But Samuel wasn't here for normal business. He was here to gather information and, if necessary, to find allies in the fight that was coming. The previous night had been spent in careful planning. After the children were asleep, Samuel and Elizabeth had sat at his kitchen table, spreading out maps of the territory and discussing options with the grim determination of generals planning a campaign. Elizabeth's knowledge of Marcus's methods and resources combined with Samuel's understanding of the local terrain and community had allowed them to piece together a strategy that might, just might, give them a chance. "He won't give up," Elizabeth had said, tracing the roads leading to Cedar Valley with her finger. "Marcus never gives up when he wants something, and he wants us back. Not because he loves us, but because we belong to him in his mind. We're his property, and he can't tolerate the idea that his property escaped." Samuel had studied the maps while she spoke, noting the various routes Marcus could take to search the area systematically. "How many men does he typically travel with?" "It depends on the job," Elizabeth had replied. "For business, usually just Jake Morrison. He's been with Marcus for 3 years now. Handles the violence when Marcus needs to keep his own hands clean. But if Marcus thinks this is important enough, he could bring more. He has connections with some very dangerous people." Now, as Samuel hitched his horse outside the sheriff's office in Rawlins, he was betting everything on his ability to read people correctly. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a man Samuel had met only a few times, but their interactions had suggested someone who cared more about justice than technicalities. If Samuel was wrong about Bradley's character, this conversation could doom them all. The sheriff was already at his desk when Samuel knocked, a cup of coffee steaming beside a stack of wanted posters and territorial notices. Bradley was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. His eyes, however, held the kind of wisdom that came from understanding the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. "Samuel Carter," Bradley said, looking up with surprise. "Don't often see you in town this early. What brings you to my office?" Samuel had rehearsed this conversation during his ride, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself struggling with how much to reveal. Too little, and Bradley wouldn't understand the gravity of the situation. Too much, and he might feel obligated to take actions that would put Elizabeth and the children in danger. "Tom," Samuel began, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk, "I need to talk to you about something confidential. Something that involves people who are in serious danger." Bradley set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. I'm listening. Have you had any inquiries recently about a missing woman and children? Man named Marcus Blackwood from Cheyenne, claiming his wife took his stepchildren and disappeared? The sheriff's eyes sharpened immediately. Matter of fact, I have. Man came by yesterday afternoon with his associate, Jake Morrison. Seemed very concerned about his missing family. Said the woman might be mentally unstable, dangerous to herself and the children. Samuel nodded grimly. What did you think of him? Bradley was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face. Why are you asking? Because I think Marcus Blackwood is a liar and a dangerous man. And I think his wife and those children are running for their lives. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Bradley picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, never taking his eyes off Samuel's face. That's a serious accusation, the sheriff said finally. What makes you think so? Samuel had prepared for this question, and he answered with careful honesty. Because I've seen what a man looks like when he's genuinely worried about missing family, and I've seen what a man looks like when he's hunting something he considers his property. Marcus Blackwood is hunting, not searching. You seem to know a lot about this situation for someone who claims not to have seen the missing family. It was a test, Samuel realized. Bradley was too experienced to miss the implications of Samuel's knowledge, but he was giving Samuel a chance to explain himself before making any official decisions. Tom, Samuel said quietly, sometimes a man finds himself in a position where he has to choose between what's legal and what's right. I'm hoping you're the kind of sheriff who understands that distinction. Bradley set down his coffee cup and opened one of the drawers in his desk. He pulled out a telegram and handed it to Samuel without comment. The message was from the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, and it made Samuel's blood run cold. Marcus Blackwood had reported his wife as mentally unstable and possibly dangerous, claiming she had threatened to harm the children if anyone tried to take them away from her. He was requesting official assistance in locating them, and the marshal's office was treating it as a potential kidnapping case. He's covering his bases, Samuel said, handing the telegram back, making sure that if anyone finds them, they'll be returned to him without questions. Or, Bradley said carefully, he's a concerned husband doing everything he can to find his missing family through proper legal channels. Samuel looked directly into the sheriff's eyes. Tom, I've been alone on my ranch for 8 years. Never had visitors, never had anyone staying with me. Yesterday morning, Marcus Blackwood and Jake Morrison rode onto my property and searched every building except my house. They claimed to be looking for his missing family, but they spent an awful lot of time examining my barn and outbuildings for men who were supposedly just asking if I'd seen anyone. The implication was clear, and Bradley's expression darkened as he processed it. They searched your property without your permission? Oh, they were polite about it, Samuel said. But it wasn't really a request. Bradley stood and walked to the window, staring out at the main street of Rawlins as he considered everything Samuel had told him. When he turned back, his decision was written clearly on his face. I've been a lawman for 23 years, he said quietly. And in that time, I've learned that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who look the most respectable. Men who use the law as a weapon against the innocent. He walked back to his desk and pulled out another piece of paper, a wanted poster that Samuel hadn't seen before. This came in on yesterday's mail, Bradley continued, handing the poster to Samuel. Jake Morrison is wanted in Colorado for assault and battery. Charges were dropped when the victim mysteriously decided not to testify, but the pattern is interesting. Samuel studied the poster, noting the detailed description and the significant reward offered. Marcus surrounds himself with men like this. Birds of a feather, Bradley said grimly. Samuel, I can't officially help you with whatever situation you're involved in. But I can tell you that if Marcus Blackwood files any complaints about trespassing or harassment, I'm going to need to see some pretty compelling evidence before I take action. It wasn't a promise of active assistance, but it was something Samuel could work with. "I appreciate your understanding, Tom." "There's something else," Bradley said, lowering his voice. Morrison was asking about gun stores, places where a man might buy ammunition in bulk. "That's not the kind of question you ask if you're just looking for missing family members." Samuel felt ice form in his stomach. Marcus was preparing for violence on a scale beyond what they had anticipated. How much ammunition? Enough for a small war. Samuel left the sheriff's office with his mind racing and rode directly to the general store, where he found Jack Wilson opening up for the day. Wilson was a veteran of the territorial wars and had the kind of practical experience with violence that Samuel was going to need. "Jack," Samuel said without preamble, "I need to ask you about something confidential." Wilson looked up from the crate he was unpacking, studying Samuel's face with the sharp attention of a man who had learned to read danger in other men's expressions. "What kind of confidential?" "The kind that involves protecting innocent people from men who mean them harm." Wilson set down the goods he was unpacking and walked to the front door, turning the sign to closed and locking it behind him. "Talk." Samuel told him everything about finding Elizabeth and the children, about Marcus's visit to the ranch, about the wanted poster and the ammunition purchases. Wilson listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "You're talking about going up against a man with money, connections, and apparently no conscience," Wilson said when Samuel finished. "That's not a fight you can win alone." "I'm not looking to win," Samuel replied. "I'm looking to make sure those children are safe. Everything else is secondary." Wilson studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "My Sarah would never forgive me if I let children come to harm when I could have prevented it. What do you need?" What followed was a planning session that drew on Wilson's military experience and Samuel's knowledge of the local terrain. By the time they were finished, Samuel had a list of supplies, a network of trusted men who could be called upon if needed, and most importantly, a backup plan if everything went wrong. "There's one more thing," Wilson said as Samuel prepared to leave. "My brother-in-law runs the telegraph office. If you need to send messages without them being traced back to you, he can help." Samuel shook the man's hand gratefully. "I may take you up on that." The ride back to the ranch took longer than usual, as Samuel made several stops to speak with neighbors and acquaintances he knew he could trust. By the time he reached home, he had quietly assembled a network of support that would make Marcus Blackwood's job considerably more difficult. Elizabeth met him at the door, her face tense with worry that had been building all day. "How did it go?" "Better than I hoped," Samuel replied, pulling her into a quick embrace that surprised them both with its naturalness. "We're not as alone as Marcus thinks we are." That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Samuel found himself looking at each face with new determination. The children were laughing at something Thomas had said, their faces bright with the kind of joy that comes from feeling safe and loved. Elizabeth was smiling, really smiling. For the first time since he had found them, these people had become his family in every way that mattered, and he would not let Marcus Blackwood destroy what they had built together. Tomorrow he would begin the final preparations for the confrontation that was coming. But tonight, he would simply enjoy the miracle of sitting at a table surrounded by the voices of people who needed him, and whom he had come to love. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the prairie, but inside, the warmth of family and the strength of determined love were preparing to face whatever storms lay ahead. The game was about to change, and Marcus Blackwood was about to discover that some prey fought back. The next week passed in a whirlwind of careful preparation, disguised as ordinary ranch life. To any casual observer, Samuel Carter was simply going about his normal business, repairing fences, tending to his livestock, and making the routine improvements that any rancher would undertake before winter set in fully. But beneath this veneer of normalcy Every action served a dual purpose in the elaborate defense strategy he was implementing. Each morning before dawn, Samuel would ride the perimeter of his property, not just checking on his cattle, but also examining the terrain with the eye of a military tactician. He identified the best vantage points for observation, the natural choke points where riders could be funneled into disadvantageous positions, and the concealed routes that could allow for quick movement without being seen from the main approaches. To the ranch, Jack Wilson had been true to his word, arriving each evening after his store closed to help with preparations that couldn't be accomplished during daylight hours. Together, they had created a series of carefully camouflaged observation posts around the ranch, each equipped with supplies and positioned to provide overlapping fields of view. More importantly, they had established a communication system using mirror signals during the day and carefully shielded lanterns at night. The key, Wilson had explained while they worked, is to know they're coming long before they know you're ready for them. But it wasn't just the physical preparations that marked this week. Inside the house, a different kind of transformation was taking place as the family settled into routines that felt increasingly natural and permanent. Elizabeth had taken over the management of the household with a quiet efficiency that impressed Samuel daily. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what needed to be done and when, organizing the children's education, managing the limited supplies to stretch them as far as possible, and somehow creating an atmosphere of normalcy despite the constant undercurrent of danger. Her relationship with Samuel had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as gratitude and mutual concern had deepened into a partnership based on genuine respect and growing affection. They worked together seamlessly, communicating often without words, each anticipating the other's needs and movements in the way that comes only from deep trust and understanding. "You know," Elizabeth said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard, "I never imagined I could feel safe again. But here, with you, I actually believe we might have a future." Samuel reached over and took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "We will have a future," he said firmly. All of us, the children too, were thriving in ways that seemed almost miraculous given their recent trauma. Michael had begun helping Samuel with the more complex ranch work, his natural intelligence and eagerness to learn making him an invaluable assistant. More importantly, the crushing weight of responsibility he had carried for so long was beginning to lift as he realized he could trust Samuel to protect the family. "Mr. Carter," Michael said one afternoon as they worked together to reinforce the barn doors, "what's going to happen when he comes back?" Samuel paused in his hammering to look at the boy directly. Michael deserved honesty, not false reassurances. "I'm going to make sure he never hurts any of you again," Samuel said simply. "Whatever it takes." Michael nodded solemnly, then surprised Samuel by saying, "I want to help. I'm old enough, and I'm tired of being scared." "The best way you can help," Samuel replied, "is by being ready to take care of your sisters and brothers if things get dangerous. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." The twins had continued to reveal their distinct personalities as they grew more comfortable in their new home. Sarah had appointed herself as the family's official record keeper, carefully documenting their daily activities in a journal she had started with paper and pencils Samuel provided. Her entries revealed not just the events of each day, but the gradual healing of a family that had been broken by violence and was slowly learning to trust and love again. Sophie, meanwhile, had become fascinated with the ranch itself, spending hours observing the animals and learning their individual personalities and needs. She had a natural way with the horses that impressed even Samuel, and several of the more temperamental animals had taken to following her around the paddock like devoted pets. Anna's hand was healing remarkably well under Dr. Harrison's continued care, and with it, her confidence was returning. She had begun helping Elizabeth with the cooking and household tasks, her face lighting up with pride whenever her efforts were praised. The nightmares that had plagued her first nights at the ranch were becoming less frequent, replaced by peaceful sleep and the occasional dream about the future she was beginning to believe in. Thomas's respiratory issues had completely resolved, leaving him energetic and curious about everything around him. He had attached himself to Samuel with the devoted admiration that 5-year-olds reserve for their heroes, following him around the ranch and asking endless questions about everything from horse behavior to weather patterns. Little Lucy had perhaps made the most remarkable recovery of all. The fever-broken, traumatized child Samuel had first carried from the barn had transformed into a bright, cheerful little girl whose laughter could lift everyone's spirits even on the darkest days. She had claimed Samuel as her personal property, insisting on sitting in his lap during story time and holding his hand whenever they walked anywhere together. It was during this period of apparent calm that the first sign of new trouble appeared. Dr. Harrison arrived for one of his routine checkups on the children, but his usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious concern. After completing his examinations and confirming that everyone was healing well, he asked to speak with Samuel privately. "I had some disturbing visitors in town yesterday," the doctor said once they were alone in Samuel's study. "Marcus Blackwood and Jake Morrison, along with 2 other men I didn't recognize. They were asking very specific questions about my recent house calls, particularly any involving children." Samuel felt his stomach clench. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful, I hope. I explained that I see dozens of children in my practice and that patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific cases." "But Samuel, they weren't just asking questions. One of them, not Blackwood or Morrison, but one of the others, had the look of someone who's used to getting information through less pleasant means." The implication was clear, and Samuel's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. "Did they threaten you directly?" "Not in so many words, but there was definitely an undertone of menace." Blackwood was all smiles and polite conversation, but his companions made it clear that they expect cooperation. Samuel walked to the window and stared out at the yard where the children were playing, their voices bright with innocent joy. The sight strengthened his resolve while simultaneously breaking his heart. These children had finally begun to feel safe, and now that safety was being threatened again. "Doc, I need you to know that we're prepared for trouble. Jack Wilson and I have been making arrangements, and Sheriff Bradley is aware of the situation. But if things get dangerous, you might want to consider taking your family somewhere safe for a while." Dr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, then surprised Samuel with his response. "Actually, I was thinking more along the lines of how I could help. My late father was a cavalry surgeon during the territorial wars, and he taught me a few things about more than just medicine." Samuel turned to stare at the older man, seeing him with new eyes. "What kind of things?" "The kind that might be useful if someone needed to disappear for a while, or if certain official records needed to be adjusted to protect innocent people." It was an offer of help that Samuel hadn't expected, but desperately needed. "That could be dangerous for you and your family." "Some things are worth the risk," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "These children have been through enough. If I can help ensure they never have to go through it again, then that's what I'm going to do." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Samuel found himself studying each face around the table with new intensity. In just 2 weeks, these people had become more precious to him than his own life. The idea of losing them, of watching Marcus Blackwood tear apart the family they had built together, was unthinkable. Elizabeth seemed to sense his mood, and after the children were asleep, she joined him on the porch where he sat staring out at the star-filled Wyoming sky. "You're worried about something new," she said, settling beside him on the wooden bench he had built years earlier for evenings with Emma. That had never come. Samuel told her about Dr. Harrison's visit and the escalating pressure Marcus was applying to find them. Elizabeth listened in silence, her face growing paler with each detail. "He's getting desperate," she said finally. "That makes him more dangerous than ever. When Marcus gets desperate, people get hurt." "Not this time," Samuel said with quiet determination. "This time, he's the one who's going to discover what it feels like to be hunted." Elizabeth turned to look at him, surprised by the steel in his voice. "Samuel, I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for us. You've already done so much, given us so much. Maybe it would be better if we just kept running, ... No." The word came out with such finality that it seemed to hang in the air between them. Running means that children spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, never feeling truly safe. It means you live in fear forever. It means this family we've built gets torn apart by a man who sees you as possessions rather than people. Samuel stood and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with hands that shook slightly with suppressed emotion. "Elizabeth, I lost my chance at family once through circumstances beyond my control. I won't lose it again to someone who thinks he can take whatever he wants through violence and intimidation." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of night birds and the whisper of wind through the grass. Finally, Elizabeth spoke, her voice soft but filled with something that might have been wonder. "You really mean that? You think of us as your family?" Samuel turned to face her, and in the moonlight, she could see the depth of emotion in his eyes. "I don't just think of you as family," he said quietly. "You are my family, every one of you. And I protect what's mine." Elizabeth stood and walked to where he stood, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "Samuel Carter, you are the best man I've ever known." What happened next felt as natural as breathing. Samuel leaned down and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. It was a kiss that spoke of promises made and futures dreamed, of two wounded souls finding healing in each other's arms. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and staring at each other with wonder and something that looked very much like love. "Elizabeth," Samuel whispered, "when this is over, would you consider making this arrangement permanent? All of it. The family, the ranch, the life we're building together?" Tears sparkled in her eyes as she smiled. "Samuel Carter, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to be my wife, and I'm asking those 6 wonderful children to be my children, legally and in every other way that matters." Elizabeth's answer was another kiss, this one filled with joy and hope, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine just weeks before. But even as they held each other under the Wyoming stars, both knew that before they could claim that future, they would have to fight for it. Marcus Blackwood was closing in, and the final confrontation was approaching fast. The family they had chosen was about to face its greatest test, and everything they had built together hung in the balance. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Billy Fletcher, who rode out from town with the kind of urgency that immediately set Samuel's nerves on edge. The boy's horse was lathered with sweat, and his face was flushed with the excitement of carrying what he clearly understood to be important news. "Mr. Carter," Billy called out as he dismounted near the porch where Samuel was teaching Thomas how to whittle. "Got an urgent message for you from town." Sheriff Bradley said to bring it out personally and wait for a reply. Samuel accepted the telegram with steady hands, though his heart rate had accelerated the moment he saw the official territorial seal. As he read the brief message, his blood ran cold. Federal marshal arriving Thursday, stop investigating kidnapping charges. Filed by Marcus Blackwood, stop search warrant pending, stop advise caution stop. Bradley L. Samuel read the message twice, his mind racing through the implications. Marcus had escalated beyond local intimidation to federal involvement, and he was using the legal system as a weapon, just as Samuel had feared. A federal marshal with a search warrant would have the authority to search every inch of the ranch, and no amount of clever hiding places would protect Elizabeth and the children from that level of scrutiny. "Billy," Samuel said, his voice calm despite the turmoil in his thoughts, "tell Sheriff Bradley that I understand the message and appreciate the warning. And here's $1 for your trouble riding out here so fast." The boy's eyes widened at the generous tip, and he rode away with considerably more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. Samuel watched him disappear over the ridge, then walked quickly into the house where Elizabeth was helping Anna with her arithmetic lessons at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," Samuel said quietly. "All of us. Can you gather the children?" Something in his tone must have alerted Elizabeth to the seriousness of the situation, because she immediately called the children together without asking questions. Within minutes, all 7 of them were seated around the kitchen table, their faces reflecting varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Samuel placed the telegram on the table and looked around at the faces that had become so precious to him. "I'm going to be honest with all of you because you deserve to know what we're facing. Marcus has convinced the federal authorities that Elizabeth kidnapped you children, and they're sending a marshal to investigate." The silence that followed was profound. Michael's face went white, and Samuel could see the boy's hands clenching into fists under the table. The twins moved closer together, seeking comfort in their unbreakable bond. Anna unconsciously cradled her healing hand against her chest as if protecting it from further harm. Thomas looked confused but picked up on the fear in the room, while little Lucy climbed into Elizabeth's lap with the instinct of a child seeking security. Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "How long do we have?" "The marshal arrives Thursday. That gives us 2 days." 2 days to run," Michael said, his young voice tight with controlled panic. "We can pack tonight and be gone by morning." "No," Samuel said firmly, and the conviction in his voice surprised even him. "No more running. If we run now, you'll spend the rest of your lives running. There will always be another marshal, another warrant, another legal maneuver. Marcus will never stop hunting you. Then what do we do?" Elizabeth asked. Though Samuel could see she already suspected what he was going to say, Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had become home to all of them. When he turned back, his face was set with determination. "We're going to make this legal," he said. "All of it. Elizabeth, you're going to divorce Marcus Blackwood and marry me today, and I'm going to formally adopt all 6 children as my own. By the time that marshal arrives, you'll be the Carter family, with all the legal protections that provides." The audacity of the plan left everyone speechless for a moment. Then Michael spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion. "You'd really do that? Make us your real family?" "You already are my real family," Samuel replied simply. "This would just make it official." Elizabeth stood and walked to Samuel, taking his hands in hers. "Samuel, what you're proposing, it would tie you to us permanently. If Marcus finds a way to challenge this, you could lose everything. Your ranch, your freedom, maybe even your life." Samuel looked down into her eyes, seeing the love and fear warring there. "Elizabeth, I've already made my choice. I made it the night I found you in my stable. The only question is whether you'll make the same choice." What followed was a family conference unlike any in the history of democratic decision-making. Each child, from 12-year-old Michael down to 3-year-old Lucy, was asked for their opinion on whether they wanted Samuel to become their legal father and Elizabeth to become his wife. The unanimous enthusiasm of their responses left both adults emotional and more determined than ever. "Then it's settled," Samuel said. "Billy Fletcher's probably halfway back to town by now, but I can catch him before he gets there. Jack Wilson can perform the marriage ceremony. He's been ordained as a justice of the peace for years. And Dr. Harrison can handle the adoption papers. We can have everything legally filed before sunset." What followed was the most frantic day of preparation any of them had ever experienced. Samuel rode hard to catch up with Billy Fletcher, sending him back to town with urgent messages to Jack Wilson, Dr. Harrison, and Sheriff Bradley. Elizabeth, with help from the children, transformed the ranch house into something suitable for both a wedding and a legal proceeding. The twins, Sarah and Sophie, appointed themselves as wedding planners, picking wildflowers from the areas around the ranch that hadn't yet been killed by frost and arranging them throughout the house. Anna, despite her injured hand, insisted on helping. Elizabeth altered one of her better dresses into something approaching wedding attire. Michael and Thomas worked together to make the main room presentable for the legal ceremonies that would take place there. By late afternoon, a small parade of visitors had arrived at the ranch. Jack Wilson came first, carrying his official Justice of the Peace credentials and a bottle of champagne he had been saving for a special occasion. Dr. Harrison arrived shortly after, his medical bag supplemented by a leather satchel containing legal documents and adoption forms. Sheriff Bradley was the last to arrive, and his presence served the dual purpose of witnessing the ceremonies and ensuring that everything was done with absolute legal correctness. "I have to ask," Sheriff Bradley said to Samuel as they stood on the porch waiting for the ceremonies to begin. "Are you sure about this? Once these papers are signed, there's no going back. You'll be legally responsible for 7 people, and if Marcus challenges this in court—" "Tom," Samuel interrupted, "I've been alone for 8 years. I thought my chance at family died with Emma. Now I've got a woman I love and 6 children who need me as much as I need them. If that's not worth fighting for, nothing is." The wedding ceremony was simple but profound. Elizabeth, wearing a blue dress that Anna had decorated with delicate embroidery, stood beside Samuel in front of the fireplace while their children gathered around them in a circle. Jack Wilson's words were brief but heartfelt, focusing on the commitment being made not just between husband and wife, but between all the members of their newly formed family. "Do you, Samuel Carter, take Elizabeth Morrison to be your wife, and do you also accept her children as your own, promising to love, protect, and provide for them as a father should?" "I do," Samuel said, his voice strong and clear. "Do you, Elizabeth Morrison, take Samuel Carter to be your husband, and do you trust him to be a father to your children and a partner in all things?" "I do," Elizabeth replied, tears streaming down her face. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by 6 children whose faces shone with joy and hope, and by 3 men who understood they were participating in something far more significant than a simple legal ceremony. The adoption proceedings that followed were more complex but equally moving. Dr. Harrison had brought official territorial adoption forms, and each child was asked to state formally that they wished Samuel Carter to become their legal father. Even little Lucy, coached by her siblings, managed to say, "Yes, please," in a voice that was audible to the assembled witnesses. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Harrison admitted as he filled out the forms. "But given the circumstances and the highly irregular," Dr. Harrison admitted as he filled out the forms. "But given the circumstances and the filings, some agisivi atuveo, clear wishes of all parties involved, I believe any territorial court would find these adoptions to be in the best interests of the children." By sunset, all the legal documents had been signed, witnessed, and prepared for filing with the territorial authorities. Samuel Carter was now legally married to Elizabeth Carter, and he was the adoptive father of Michael, Sarah, Sophie, Anna, Thomas, and Lucy Carter. The transformation was complete, at least on paper. "There's one more thing," Sheriff Bradley said as the others prepared to leave. He pulled out an official-looking document and handed it to Samuel. "This is a restraining order against Marcus Blackwood and Jake Morrison. It prohibits them from coming onto your property or having any contact with your family without court supervision." Samuel studied the document with surprise. "How did you manage this?" "Jake Morrison's wanted status gave me grounds to consider him a threat to public safety, and Marcus's pattern of behavior, combined with witness statements about his intimidation, tactics provided justification for the restraining order. It won't stop them if they're really determined, but it gives us legal grounds to arrest them if they show up here. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, the newly formed Carter family gathered around their dinner table for the first time as a legally recognized unit. The children were subdued but happy, still processing the magnitude of the day's changes. Elizabeth sat beside Samuel, occasionally reaching over to touch his hand as if to reassure herself that this miraculous transformation was real. "So what happens tomorrow?" Michael asked as they finished their meal. "Tomorrow we continue building our life together," Samuel replied. "We tend the ranch, we work on your education, and we act like the family we've always been in our hearts." "And when the marshal comes on Thursday?" Anna asked quietly. Samuel looked around the table at his family, his legal, official, unassailable family, and smiled with confidence he hadn't felt in weeks. "When the marshal comes on Thursday, he'll find the Carter family living peacefully on their ranch. He'll find legal adoption papers, a legal marriage certificate, and absolutely no evidence of any kidnapping. Because there was no kidnapping. There was only a family forming in the way that families sometimes do, through love, choice, and commitment rather than just blood." Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the prairie with the promise of winter storms approaching. But inside, the warm ranch house, 8 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances settled into their first night as an officially recognized family, protected by law and bound together by something stronger than any legal document could ever capture. The final test was coming, but they would face it together as the Carter family. With all the rights and protections that name provided, Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. Thursday morning, his official carriage kicking up dust clouds that could be seen from miles away across the prairie. Samuel had been expecting him, of course, but the sight of the black government vehicle approaching his ranch still sent a chill down his spine. Everything they had worked for, everything they had built together, would be tested in the next few hours. Hayes was a man in his late 40s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. His gray suit was immaculate despite the long journey from Cheyenne, and his pale blue eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to detecting lies and inconsistencies. He was accompanied by a younger man who Samuel assumed was a deputy or assistant, and both men carried themselves with the quiet authority that came from representing federal power. Samuel met them at the front gate, flanked by Jack Wilson and Sheriff Bradley, who had arrived an hour earlier to ensure that the investigation proceeded according to proper protocols. The presence of local law enforcement sent an important message. This family had nothing to hide and welcomed official scrutiny. "Marshal Hayes," Samuel said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Samuel Carter. I understand you're here about some allegations involving my family." Hayes accepted the handshake with professional courtesy, though his eyes were already scanning the ranch buildings with the practiced gaze of an investigator. "Mr. Carter, I'm here to investigate charges of kidnapping filed by Marcus Blackwood of Cheyenne. He claims his wife and 6 stepchildren were taken from their home and are being held against their will." "I see," Samuel replied calmly. "Well, you're welcome to investigate whatever you need to investigate. My family and I have nothing to hide." The word family hung in the air with deliberate emphasis, and Samuel saw Hayes make a mental note of it. Good. Let the marshal understand from the beginning that he wasn't dealing with temporary refugees, but with legally established relationships. "I'll need to speak with the woman and children separately," Hayes said, consulting a small notebook. "The allegations suggest they may be too frightened to speak freely in your presence." "Of course," Samuel agreed. "Though I should mention that my wife Elizabeth and our children have had some traumatic experiences recently. They may be nervous around strangers, particularly men in positions of authority." Hayes raised an eyebrow at the casual reference to wife and our children. And Samuel could see the marshal reassessing the situation he had expected to find. "Your wife, Mr. Carter?" "Elizabeth and I were married 2 days ago," Samuel explained, producing the official marriage certificate from his jacket pocket. "Here's the documentation, properly witnessed and filed with territorial authorities." Hayes examined the certificate with the thoroughness of someone who had seen numerous fraudulent documents in his career. But Jack Wilson's signature as officiating justice of the peace, combined with the official territorial seal and proper filing stamps, left no room for doubt about its authenticity. "And the children?" Samuel handed over the adoption papers with the same calm confidence. "I formally adopted all 6 children as my own." Again, everything properly documented and legally filed. The marshal's expression grew increasingly puzzled as he reviewed the adoption documents. Whatever scenario he had been prepared to investigate, it clearly hadn't included legally married parents and properly adopted children. "Mr. Carter," Hayes said finally, "these documents appear to be in order, but they're dated very recently. Just 2 days ago, in fact. That's quite a coincidence, given that I'm here investigating allegations of kidnapping." Samuel had prepared for this question, and his answer was carefully crafted to be both truthful and strategically advantageous. "Marshal, when Elizabeth first came to me seeking help, she and the children were in desperate circumstances. They had been living rough for weeks. The children were sick and malnourished, and they were clearly terrified of someone. As I got to know them and learned their story, I realized they needed legal protection as much as they needed food and shelter." "What story did they tell you?" "That Elizabeth had been trapped in an abusive marriage and had finally found the courage to leave with her children. That her husband had beaten her severely and had been escalating his violence toward the children. That they had been running for weeks, trying to find somewhere safe." Hayes made notes as Samuel spoke, occasionally glancing toward the house where the family waited inside. "And you believed his story?" "Marshal, I've seen Elizabeth's injuries. I've seen the children's reaction to sudden noises and unexpected visitors. I've watched a 12-year-old boy who acts like he's carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, and a 9-year-old girl with deliberately broken bones that were never properly set. Whatever was happening to this family before they came, to me, it wasn't good." The marshal studied Samuel's face for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile the allegations he had been sent to investigate with the evidence he was finding. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to need to speak with your wife and the children individually. I hope you understand that this is necessary." "Absolutely," Samuel agreed. "Though I would ask that Sheriff Bradley be present during any interviews with the children. They trust him, and his presence may help them feel more comfortable." Hayes nodded his agreement, and the group moved toward the house. Samuel entered first, followed by the marshal and his assistant. Elizabeth was waiting in the main room with the children arranged around her in what looked like a natural family grouping, but which Samuel recognized as a carefully planned tableau designed to reinforce their legal relationship. "Elizabeth," Samuel said gently, "this is Federal Marshal Hayes. He's here to ask some questions about our family." Elizabeth stood with the graceful composure of a woman who had nothing to hide, though Samuel could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness. "Marshal Hayes, welcome to our home. I hope you'll forgive the children if they seem a bit shy. They've had some difficult experiences with strangers recently." Hayes introduced himself to the family with professional courtesy, his trained eyes taking in every detail of their appearance and behavior. Samuel watched him note the children's clean, well-fed appearance, their comfortable interaction with both Samuel and Elizabeth, and the obvious affection they showed for each other. "Mrs. Carter," Hayes began, and Elizabeth's slight smile at the name didn't escape his notice. "I need to ask you some questions about your previous marriage and the circumstances that brought you to this ranch." What followed was the most carefully orchestrated performance of Elizabeth's life. She told her story with calm precision, describing Marcus Blackwood's escalating abuse, his violence toward the children, and her growing fear that he would eventually kill one of them. She spoke of planning their escape for months, gathering supplies and waiting for the right opportunity. "And how did you come to know Mr. Carter?" Hayes asked. "I didn't know him at all," Elizabeth replied honestly. "We had been traveling for weeks, sleeping wherever we could find shelter. The children were sick and exhausted, and I was desperate. When we saw his ranch, I thought perhaps we could rest in his barn for one night without being discovered. I never intended for him to find us, but he did find you." "Yes, and instead of turning us away, he brought us into his home, fed us, and called for medical attention for the children. He saved our lives, Marshal Hayes." Hayes made careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. Samuel was impressed by Elizabeth's performance. She answered every question with apparent honesty, while carefully steering the narrative away from any details that might raise suspicions about the timing of their legal maneuvers. When Hayes asked to speak with the children individually, they were ready. Each child told the same basic story. Their stepfather Marcus had been cruel and violent. Their mother had brought them west to escape him, and Samuel had taken them in and treated them with kindness. The consistency of their accounts, combined with their obvious comfort in Samuel's presence, painted a clear picture of a family that had formed through necessity and grown through genuine affection. Michael, as the oldest, was questioned most thoroughly. Hayes clearly expected that if there were any coercion or false testimony involved, it would be most apparent in the 12-year-old's responses. "Son," Hayes said gently, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you happy living here? With Mr. Carter?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied without hesitation. "He's the best man I've ever known. He treats Maya with respect, and he treats us like we're really his children, not just burdens he has to put up with." "And you want him to be your adoptive father?" "More than anything," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in years, I don't have to worry about protecting my brothers and sisters every minute of every day. Mr. Carter does that now, and he's stronger than I am." Hayes spent nearly an hour with the children, questioning each one carefully about their experiences both before and after arriving at the ranch. But every answer reinforced the same narrative. They had been rescued from an abusive situation by a man who had chosen to protect them and eventually to make them his family. The marshal's assistant had spent the time examining the house and outbuildings, looking for any evidence that the family was being held against their will or that their presence was temporary rather than permanent. But the children's belongings were integrated throughout the house. Elizabeth's things were mixed with Samuel's in what was clearly a shared bedroom, and everything pointed to a family that had settled in for the long term. "Mr. Carter," Hayes said as he prepared to conclude his investigation, "I have to admit, this isn't what I expected to find when I came here." "What did you expect, Marshal?" "Based on Mr. Blackwood's allegations, I expected to find a woman and children being held against their will by someone who had taken them from their legitimate home. Instead, I find a legally married couple with properly adopted children who show every sign of being genuinely happy together." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Marshal, I can't speak to Mr. Blackwood's motivations for filing these charges, but I can tell you that my family is here by choice, protected by law, and determined to build a life together." Hayes closed his notebook and looked around the comfortable ranch house one more time. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, children, I want to thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. Based on what I've seen and heard today, I'll be reporting to my superiors that I found no evidence of kidnapping or coercion. This appears to be a case of a woman leaving an unhappy marriage and finding a new life with someone who treats her and her children well." The relief that swept through the room was almost palpable, though the family was careful not to show too much emotion until the marshal was actually gone. Hayes and his assistant gathered their things and prepared to leave, but not before the marshal had one final word with Samuel. "Mr. Carter, I should warn you that Mr. Blackwood may not accept this report lying down. Men like him don't like to lose, especially when it comes to what they consider their property." "Marshal," Samuel replied quietly, "my family is not anyone's property. They're under my protection now, and I take that responsibility very seriously." Hayes nodded with something that might have been approval. "I hope it doesn't come to that, but if it does, you seem like a man who can handle himself." After the marshal's carriage disappeared over the horizon, the Carter family allowed themselves to celebrate their victory. The federal investigation had not only failed to find evidence of wrongdoing, but had actually reinforced the legitimacy of their new family structure. They had passed the ultimate test, but even as they celebrated, Samuel knew that Marcus Blackwood would not be deterred by a federal marshal's report. The man who had terrorized this family for years would not simply accept defeat and walk away. The legal battle might be over, but the real war was just beginning, and Samuel Carter was ready for it. The attack came 3 days after Marshal Hayes departed, arriving with the pre-dawn darkness that Marcus Blackwood had always favored for his most violent work. Samuel had been expecting it. Of course, the federal investigation's complete vindication of the Carter family had been a humiliation that a man like Marcus could never tolerate. What Samuel hadn't anticipated was the sheer audacity of the assault that followed. The first sign of trouble was the absence of sound. The ranch's dogs, who normally greeted every sunrise with enthusiastic barking, were ominously silent. Samuel woke from restless sleep with the instinctive awareness that something was wrong. His years of frontier living having taught him to trust his subconscious warnings about danger, he slipped from bed without waking Elizabeth, moving silently through the house to peer out the front windows. The observation posts he and Jack Wilson had established were invisible in the darkness, but Samuel knew they were there, and he knew that if Marcus had managed to approach the ranch undetected, it meant his sentries had been neutralized. The soft scrape of boot leather against wood told Samuel that someone was on his front porch. He moved quickly but quietly to the hidden weapons cache he had prepared for this moment, retrieving his rifle and a bandolier of ammunition. Behind him, Elizabeth stirred in her sleep, and Samuel froze until he was certain she hadn't awakened. Whatever was about to happen, he wanted his family to have every possible second of safety. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shattered the peaceful silence of the ranch house. Marcus Blackwood strode through the splintered doorway like an avenging angel, his expensive clothes replaced by the practical gear of a man preparing for violence. Behind him came Jake Morrison and 2 other men Samuel didn't recognize, all of them armed and moving with the coordinated precision of experienced killers. "Where is she?" Marcus roared, his cultured facade completely abandoned in favor of raw fury. "Where is my wife?" Samuel stepped into view at the top of the stairs, his rifle leveled at Marcus's chest. "Your wife is dead," he said calmly. "Elizabeth Carter is sleeping in her bed with her husband, as she has every right to do." Marcus's face contorted with rage at the words, and Samuel could see the man's carefully maintained self-control finally snapping completely. "You think a piece of paper changes anything? You think the law protects you from me?" "I think," Samuel replied, his voice deadly quiet, "that you're trespassing on my property, threatening my family, and about to discover what happens to men who make that mistake." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Samuel could hear movement upstairs as Elizabeth and the children woke to the sounds of confrontation. He prayed they would remember their instructions and get to the hidden room immediately, but he couldn't risk taking his eyes off Marcus to check. Morrison made the first move, swinging his rifle toward the stairs where Samuel stood. But Samuel had been expecting exactly that action, and his shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. What followed was controlled chaos. Marcus and his remaining men scattered for cover while Samuel used his elevated position and knowledge of the house's layout to maximum advantage. The furniture Elizabeth had arranged so carefully for family meals became improvised fortifications, and the children's toys scattered across the floor became obstacles that tripped up attackers who didn't know the house's geography. But Samuel was outnumbered, and he knew that his tactical advantages would only last so long. He needed help, and he needed it fast. The help came from an unexpected direction. The sound of breaking glass from the back of the house announced the arrival of reinforcements, but instead of more of Marcus's men, Samuel heard Jack Wilson's voice shouting orders to what sounded like several other men. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons immediately." Samuel risked a glance toward the back of the house and felt his heart leap with relief. Marshal Hayes had returned, and he had brought help. The federal lawman moved through the house with professional efficiency, flanked by what appeared to be territorial militia members. "Marcus Blackwood," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the absolute authority of federal law. "You are under arrest for assault, breaking and entering, violation of a federal restraining order, and attempted kidnapping." Marcus's response was a snarl of pure rage followed by a wild shot in Hayes's direction. But the federal marshal was no stranger to armed confrontations, and he returned fire with the precision of a trained professional. Marcus stumbled backward, clutching his right arm, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. The remaining members of Marcus's assault team, seeing their leader wounded and facing federal agents, quickly threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving the ranch house looking like a war zone. But with the Carter family triumphant, Elizabeth appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale but determined, the children clustered behind her in the protective formation they had practiced. Samuel reached them in 3 quick strides, gathering his family into his arms with relief so intense it left him shaking. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his hands moving over each child, checking for injuries that weren't there. "We're fine," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We heard the shooting and hid in the room like you taught us, but when we heard Marshal Hayes... You did exactly right," Samuel said, kissing her forehead and then reaching out to embrace each of the children in turn. "You're all safe, it's over." Marshal Hayes approached them as they stood together, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an explanation. After my investigation last week, I became suspicious about Mr. Blackwood's true motivations. I did some additional research into his background and discovered a pattern of behavior toward women and children that suggested my initial report might have been incomplete." Samuel looked up from where he was kneeling beside little Lucy, who had attached herself to his leg with the desperate grip of a child who had been truly frightened. "What kind of pattern?" 3 previous wives, all of whom died under suspicious circumstances. Multiple reports of violence toward children that were dismissed when witnesses mysteriously changed their testimony. And most importantly, business associates who described him as a man who believed he owned whatever he claimed as his property. Elizabeth's intake of breath was sharp and painful. 3 wives? He told me I was his second marriage, that his first wife had died of consumption. His first wife fell down the stairs, Hayes said grimly. His second wife died in a house fire. His third wife, a woman named Margaret Collins, simply disappeared one night, along with her 2 young children from a previous marriage. They were never found. The implications of what Hayes was saying sent chills through everyone present. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just an abusive husband. He was potentially a serial killer who targeted women with children, using marriage as a means to gain legal control over his victims. "Why didn't this information come up during your first investigation?" Samuel asked. "Because," Hayes replied, "Mr. Blackwood has been very careful to operate in different territories, using different names and identities. It was only when I started digging deeper that I discovered the pattern. And by then, I realized that you and your family were in immediate danger. Hayes gestured toward the men who were being led away in shackles. "I've been watching your ranch for 2 days, waiting for him to make his move. I knew he wouldn't accept defeat, and I wanted to catch him in the act of violating the restraining order. The marshal's foresight had undoubtedly saved lives, and—" Samuel felt a profound gratitude toward the federal lawman who had gone far beyond his official duties to protect them. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked. "Now," Hayes said with satisfaction, "Marcus Blackwood faces federal charges that will put him away for the rest of his life. And you go on with your lives as the Carter family, with no one to fear and no reason to look over your shoulders." The cleanup took most of the day. The front door would need to be completely rebuilt. Several windows required replacement, and Elizabeth's carefully arranged furniture bore the scars of the morning's violence. But the house still stood, the family was unharmed, and most importantly, the threat that had haunted them for so long was finally eliminated. As evening approached and the last of the federal agents departed, the Carter family gathered around their damaged but still functional dinner table. The meal Elizabeth prepared was simple: soup and bread, with apple pie that somehow had survived the morning's chaos unscathed. But it tasted like victory. "So what happens next?" Michael asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Samuel looked around the table at the faces that had become so precious to him. "Next, we rebuild what was damaged, and we continue building our life together. We finish getting the ranch ready for winter. We continue your education, and we start planning for the future." "What kind of future?" Sarah asked, her practical mind already working through possibilities. Samuel reached over and took Elizabeth's hand, smiling at the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. "The kind of future where families grow," he said meaningfully. Elizabeth blushed and squeezed his hand, but her smile was radiant. They hadn't discussed it with the children yet, but the possibility of expanding their family through children of their own was something they had talked about during quiet evening conversations. "You mean ... double quotes Anna began, her eyes wide with excitement. "We mean," Elizabeth said gently, "that this family is built on love, and love has room to grow." The celebration that followed was joyous but subdued, tempered by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything they had built together. But as the evening progressed and the children began to relax back into the comfortable rhythms of family life, Samuel felt a profound sense of completion. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of life without really living. Now he was a husband and father, surrounded by people who needed him and whom he cherished beyond measure. The transformation had come through circumstances he never could have anticipated, but it had led him to exactly where he belonged. Later that night, as Elizabeth tucked the children into beds that had been carefully checked for safety, Samuel stood on his repaired front porch and looked out over the ranch that had become their fortress. The Wyoming wind still sang its eternal song across the prairie, but now it carried promises of spring planting and summer harvests, of children's laughter and family celebrations, of a future filled with the kind of joy he had thought was lost to him forever. Behind him, he heard Elizabeth's footsteps as she joined him in contemplating their domain. "Any regrets?" she asked softly, slipping her arm through his. Samuel thought about the question seriously. The past few months had brought danger, violence, and challenges that had tested every skill and resource he possessed. His quiet, orderly life had been completely transformed, replaced by the beautiful chaos of a large family with all its attendant joys and complications. "Only one," he said finally. Elizabeth looked up at him with concern. "What's that?" Samuel smiled and pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the solid warmth of her presence beside him. "I regret that it took me 8 years to find you." Elizabeth laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the Wyoming night. "Well," she said, "we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." As they stood together under the vast star-filled sky, surrounded by the sounds of their sleeping children, and the peaceful night sounds of their ranch, Samuel Carter knew that some discoveries were worth waiting a lifetime for. He had found his family in the most unlikely place and under the most extraordinary circumstances, but he had found them, and that, he thought as Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder with the trusting contentment of a woman who finally felt safe, was worth everything they had endured to get here. The man who had found a beaten woman and 6 orphans sleeping in his stable had gained far more than he had given. He had found his purpose, his joy, and his reason for living. He had found his home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.